Listen carefully, because the history you were taught about medieval queens is a beautiful lie. And castles that looked like something from a dream. They told you these women lived in luxury. They told you they lived in power. But they never told you what happened after the doors closed. They never told you about the girls who were married off before they even understood what marriage meant. They never told you about the queens who smiled in public and cried alone in freezing stone chambers at night. And they definitely never told you how many crowns were paid for in blood. Because in the medieval world, a queen could wear gold, can still live like a prisoner. And while she stood beneath chandeliers and painted ceilings, millions outside the castle walls were fighting a far more brutal battle just to survive. In medieval Europe, a queen's life rarely began with love. It began with negotiation. Across cold halls and candlelit chambers, powerful men arranged royal marriages like military alliances. The bride's opinion was not required, her fears were not recorded, and her childhood was often quietly erased in the name of politics. Many future queens were promised away before they even reached their teenage years. One of the most famous examples was Isabella of France, who at just 12 years old was sent across the sea to marry Edward II of England. The journey that should have marked the beginning of a royal fairy tale instead carried a frightened child into a foreign court filled with tension, ambition, and silent danger. From the moment she arrived, Isabella learned a truth many queens discovered too late. A crown could elevate your status, but it could not guarantee your safety. Inside the palace, the pressure on queens was relentless and brutally simple. Above all else, they were expected to produce a male heir. Not happiness, not partnership, not love, a son. Their worth, their security, and sometimes even their survival depended on it. If a queen succeeded, she was praised and celebrated. If she failed, the whispers began almost immediately. Courtiers watched closely. Advisors grew impatient. And history shows us just how quickly royal favor could turn into mortal danger. Consider the fate of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII of England. She rose higher than almost any woman in England, capturing the king's obsession and reshaping the religious future of an entire nation. Yet when she failed to give Henry the son he desperately wanted, the love that once elevated her turned cold and then deadly. In 1536, Anne Boleyn was imprisoned inside the Tower of London and executed shortly after. A crowned queen, abandoned by the very power that had once lifted her so high. But even this suffering inside castle walls was only part of the story. Because while queens navigated the dangerous politics of the court, the ordinary people of medieval Europe were enduring a life that was often far harsher and far more unforgiving. Royal power was expensive, and someone always had to pay for it. That cost fell most heavily on the peasants, the laborers, and the countless families whose names history barely bothered to record. Under the rigid system of serfdom, many peasants were legally bound to the land they worked. They could not freely leave. They could not easily refuse demands. They were born into a life that offered little chance of escape. When harvests were good, they survived. When harvests failed, they starved. And harvests failed often. Long winters, relentless rains, and primitive farming methods meant that entire villages could slide from survival into desperation in a single season. Mothers stretched thin portions of bread. Fathers worked fields from darkness to darkness. Children learned the meaning of hunger far too early. Meanwhile, inside castle walls, royal banquets continued beneath the glow of candlelight. But hunger was only the beginning of the people's suffering. When kings went to war, and medieval kings went to war often, the true destruction usually fell on the countryside. During the long campaigns of Edward III of England, armies repeatedly crossed through farming regions, leaving burned homes, looted villages, and displaced families behind them. For ordinary people caught in the path of marching soldiers, war was not glorious. It was terror wearing armor. Then, in the mid-14th century, disaster arrived on a scale Europe had never seen before. The Black Death swept across the continent like a shadow that could not be outrun. Villages emptied, mass graves filled, entire families vanished within days. For the poor, there were no royal physicians waiting behind heavy doors, and no carefully prepared remedies. There was only fear, prayer, and the constant tolling of church bells. Yet even as death spread from town to town, the demands of the crown did not disappear. Taxes were still collected. Rents were still demanded. Obligations remained, even for the starving and the grieving. Eventually, the pressure became too great to contain. In the summer of 1381, the people of England did something that terrified the ruling class. They pushed back. The peasants' revolt of 1381 erupted as thousands of ordinary men and women marched toward London, driven by years of crushing taxation, forced labor, and broken promises. For a brief and electric moment, the powerful felt something unfamiliar fear. Because the medieval system depended on silence, and the people were no longer silent. But rebellions in this era rarely ended gently, and as the dust settled, the old order tightened its grip once more. Yet inside the royal courts, some queens had been watching all of this very carefully. Watching the instability, watching the weaknesses, watching the fear. And a few of them began to realize something dangerous. Even in a brutal world designed to control them, power could still be seized by those bold enough to reach for it. After years of political isolation and public humiliation under the rule of Edward II of England, Isabella made a decision that shocked medieval Europe. In 1326, she crossed the sea, gathered allies, and launched an invasion against her own husband's kingdom. It was an act so bold that it shattered every expectation of what a medieval queen was supposed to be. Within months, Edward II was forced from power, and for a brief moment, the woman once treated as a political pawn became the most powerful figure in England. But the medieval world was never kind to women who rose too high. Over time, Isabella herself was pushed aside as her son, Edward III of England, took full control of the throne. The same brutal currents of power she had once mastered slowly closed around her as well. Because in the end, the greatest truth of the medieval crown remained unchanged. No victory was permanent. No safety was guaranteed. And no one, queen or commoner, ever stood completely secure. So the next time history shows you a medieval queen draped in gold, remember what the paintings do not show: the fear behind the crown, the pressure behind the marriage, and the blood beneath the throne. Because the medieval world was never a fairy tale. It was a battlefield where everyone, from the highest queen to the poorest farmer, was simply trying to survive. History remembers the crowns, but the shadows tell the real story.